They were convinced their tanks were invincible. The Type 95 Hago had proven itself against Chinese forces.
Against Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol and in sweeping victories across Malaya and the Philippines, they believed their tanks were invincible.
They were wrong. The story begins not with defeat, but with confidence born from years of success. The Hago was no accident of design. It was careful military planning that began in 1933. The Type 89 medium tank could only manage 15 miles per hour, utterly inadequate for mechanized warfare. Japanese planners wanted a tank that could keep up with motorized infantry moving at 40 miles per hour. The Army Technical Bureau issued specifications in July 1933 for a 7-ton tank with speed.
Mitsubishi Heavy Industries received the contract. Engineer Tomio Hara took on the challenge with innovative suspension design. By June 1934, Mitsubishi completed the first prototype. It impressed military observers during field trials. It was fast, reaching 45 kilometers per hour on roads and maintaining 30 cross-country through rough terrain. The diesel engine was a point of pride, making the tank less vulnerable to fires than gasoline-powered vehicles. Trials revealed problems. The suspension pitched violently on rough ground, making aiming while moving nearly impossible. Engineers addressed this by adding braces to connect the bogie pairs, creating the Manchurian suspension modification. In 1930-55, the Type 95 was formally presented as the main tank for mechanized infantry units. Production began at Mitsubishi facilities in 1936. The Hago was indeed a small tank by any standard. It measured just 14 feet 4 inches long, 6 feet 9 inches wide, and under 7 feet tall. The armor was thin by any standard, 12 millimeters at its thickest points, designed to stop rifle bullets. Inside the tank was cramped. The crew consisted of 3 men in impossibly tight quarters with limited visibility. The commander had perhaps the most difficult job in the Imperial Japanese Army, operating everything alone. He had to command the tank, operate the main gun, load that gun, and operate a second machine gun. American tankers who examined captured Hagos marveled that anyone could function effectively under such conditions. But in its intended role against opponents it was designed to fight, the Hago performed very well indeed. The tank first saw significant action in China starting in 1937 against forces with virtually no armor. Against Chinese forces with limited anti-tank weapons, the Hago was devastating. Its mobility allowed it to exploit breakthroughs. Japanese tank crews gained combat experience and confidence. They learned their trade in an environment where they were clearly superior. This success bred a dangerous assumption that the Hago was genuinely capable rather than optimized for limited scenarios.
The assumption was tested at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where Japanese forces clashed with the Soviet Union.
Here the Hago faced real opposition. Soviet tanks mounted 45mm guns with better armor penetration than Japanese guns.
Soviet armor was thicker, making frontal engagements difficult. The battles at Khalkhin Gol were brutal for Japanese tank crews.
On July 2, 1939, Japanese tanks attacked Soviet positions. Initial assault achieved some success through aggressive tactics.
Japanese tanks destroyed 32 Soviet tanks and captured 35 armored vehicles in the initial assault's chaos. But Soviet counterattacks in following days revealed the Hago's vulnerabilities. Soviet guns could penetrate Japanese armor at range.
By the end of Khalkhin Gol, Japan had lost dozens of tanks. The lessons were clear to anyone paying attention.
The Hago was outmatched by modern Soviet armor. Its thin protection and weak gun were not adequate for peer combat.
But these lessons were not fully absorbed. Japanese leadership focused on tactics rather than fundamental redesign of armor.
The war in China continued, and there the Hago remained effective against opponents with no serious anti-tank capability.
When war broke out across the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese tank units achieved remarkable successes in Malaya. Hago tanks navigated terrain British commanders thought impossible. They moved through rubber plantations supporting the rapid Japanese advance.
British forces who had not deployed significant armor to Malaya were unprepared for this mobile threat, pushing towards Singapore.
In the Philippines, Hagos landed with invasion force and supported Japanese infantry operations against American and Filipino defenders.
On December 22, 1941, north of Damortis, Type 95 tanks engaged American M3 Stuart light tanks.
This was the first tank versus tank battle involving U.S. forces in the Pacific. Both tanks mounted 37mm guns. The M3 had better armor, but at close range in jungle fighting, the Japanese achieved some success. They destroyed one M3 in initial engagement. These early victories reinforced Japanese confidence in their armor and tactics.
But for Marines walking among destroyed tanks afterward, a different truth emerged about Japanese armor's actual capabilities.
When orders came to defend Saipan, the Japanese brought their tanks without questioning their adequacy against modern American forces.
Saipan was different from battles before. The island was strategically vital, positioned just 1,250 miles from Tokyo.
If Americans captured Saipan, their B-29 bombers would be within range of Japanese home islands. Empire's leaders knew this. They fortified Saipan with approximately 30,000 troops, nearly double what American intelligence estimated. The regiment was equipped with 44 tanks, a mixture of Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. The Americans began their assault on June 5, 1944. Vice Admiral Turner ordered the landing force ashore. At 0700 hours, landing craft moved toward beaches. At 0830, the first wave hit the shore under heavy fire. Marines fought their way inland against fierce resistance. By nightfall, 20,000 American combat troops were ashore with equipment. Among the equipment were M4 Sherman medium tanks, landing from LST vessels and moving forward to support infantry.
General Saito, commanding Japanese forces, recognized the critical situation. He needed to strike before Americans were fully prepared.
Saito issued orders for major counterattack, using the island's most powerful assets, infantry and the 9th Tank Regiment.
The attack order was specific. Infantry would assault American positions while tanks charged to throw the enemy into disorder. It was ambitious, requiring coordination between infantry and armor in a night attack across difficult terrain.
They conducted final maintenance checks on vehicles. Crews loaded ammunition, filled fuel tanks, checked track tension, tested radios. The crews were confident. Many had combat experience from China or earlier Pacific campaigns. They trusted their machines and tactics. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 7-10th, the Japanese tank column moved out. Diesel engines coughed to life.
Tracks clanked as tanks formed up and began their approach toward American lines. Inside each cramped vehicle, crews felt familiar vibration.
The Americans heard them coming. Marine sentries on the perimeter reported engine sounds from the north. Officers shouted orders. Men grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions. Anti-tank gun crews traversed their 37mm guns toward approaching sounds. Sherman tank crews who had bedded down near their vehicles climbed aboard and started engines. Machine gun teams checked weapons and ammunition.
At 3:30 hours, the Japanese attack began in earnest. 44 tanks, the largest armored formation yet committed by Japan. Some tanks carried infantry clinging to hulls, a dangerous but sometimes effective tactic. The formation moved through darkness toward their objectives. Marine riflemen saw them first as dark shapes emerging from pre-dawn gloom. Then came the distinctive. Japanese tankers could see Marines in their positions, could see the defensive line ahead. Some commanders opened fire with whole machine guns sweeping the ground ahead.
Then something unexpected happened. Marine machine gunners positioned in foxholes opened fire with their Browning M2 heavy machine guns.
These were not standard infantry machine guns. These were 50 caliber weapons, heavy machine guns designed to engage aircraft and destroy light vehicles.
The 50 caliber Browning 2 fired a 12.7mm round at muzzle velocity exceeding 2,900 feet per second. Marine machine gunners opened fire. Trace rounds arced across the battlefield in brilliant orange-red lines. Gunners aimed at advancing tanks, some not entirely believing their weapons would be effective against armor. What happened next shocked both sides. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds didn't just dent the tanks. They didn't ricochet off. They penetrated cleanly, decisively through the thin armor. At close range, some rounds went completely through the thin armor, entering one side of the tank and exiting the other. Inside Japanese tanks, crews experienced something far worse than defeat. Rounds coming through the armor. In the cramped interior of a Hago, there was nowhere to hide. A round that penetrated the hull could...
One Marine machine gunner firing from a position near the airfield reported watching his tracer round strike a Hago advancing directly toward him.
The tank kept coming for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. Engine smoke poured from the rear deck. The crew attempted to bail out.
Another gunner positioned with his weapon mounted on a half-track engaged a Hago at approximately 150 meters. His loader fed another belt of ammunition into the gun. He watched the commander in the turret slump forward, then fall.
A third Marine, manning a .50 caliber in a fixed position, engaged multiple tanks as they advanced. He fired at one Hago's.
His rounds penetrated the thin 6mm armor covering the engine. The diesel engine, its cylinders opened by .50 caliber.
The crew abandoned it, running back toward Japanese lines through a hail of small arms fire. Japanese tank crews who survived the initial... They had trained for years. They had fought in China, where enemy weapons bounced harmlessly off their armor. Their tanks were supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental premise of armored warfare. The tank's armor kept the crew alive while they engaged the enemy with superior firepower. Not anti-tank guns firing large caliber projectiles, not artillery, not even the massive 75mm guns on
Weapons that were mounted on jeeps, on half-tracks, on every vehicle in the American arsenal. The realization was devastating for Japanese tank crews. If machine guns could penetrate their tanks, what chance did they hack? Japanese tank captured.
He simply could not accept that a conventional heavy machine gun could defeat a tank. In his entire combat experience from training in Manchuria, but the Browning M2 was in an entirely different category from anything the Japanese had previously encountered. With its armor-pierced, and the Marines had these weapons everywhere. They were standard equipment throughout the American military. As the Japanese tank attacked, the contrast was stark. Where the Hago weighed 7.4 tons, the M4 Sherman weighed 31.8 tons. Where the Hago had 12mm of armor, the Sherman had 51mm on the frontal hull, angled at 56 degrees. When Shermans opened fire on the Japanese tanks, the outcome was predetermined. 75mm armor-piercing
ammunition detonated inside crew compartments. Japanese tanks that returned fire found their 37mm rounds complete.
One Japanese tank commander, whose Hago was disabled by .50 caliber fire but whose turret could still traverse, attempted to engage. The 37mm gun fired its armor-piercing round. The projectile struck the Sherman's turret face. There was a flash of impact. The battle evolved into what one Marine officer later described as a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. Infantry that had been riding on the tanks scattered, seeking cover in shell holes and drainage ditches. Some Japanese infantry made it to the Marine infantry, hunkered in their foxholes, found themselves with Japanese tanks passing directly over them. One Marine later reported he remained still until it moved on, then emerged and threw a thermite grenade into the engine compartment as the tank moved past. Another Marine, lying low in his foxhole as a tank rolled over him, jumped out after it passed and jammed a coconut log. When the confused tank commander opened his turret hatch to see what was wrong, the Marine jumped onto the tank and dropped a thermite grenade in.
By mid-morning on June 17th, the Japanese counterattack was over. 31 destroyed Japanese tanks littered the battlefield.